So good morning, everybody. Welcome to St. Paul's in Chestnut Hill. And we are delighted as a follow-up to our celebration of the Blessed Absalom Jones a couple of weeks ago to have Arthur Sudler from St. Thomas's, a church that is very important in the life of our diocese and our national church, a church that was served by Absalom Jones. And we are looking today at the connections between his ministry and the Great Yellow Fever epidemic, and obviously parallels between the dual pandemic of racism and COVID-19, obviously. So Arthur, we're delighted you're with us, and you're going to be speaking for about half an hour, and then we're going to open it for Q&A. So I invite participants to mute their mics, and Arthur, it's all yours.
Thank you, Father Ogle. I appreciate that very much. I want to thank you and Father Klein for this marvelous invitation to be here with you this morning. It's been a while since Father Cutler invited me to be the homilist, but I still remember that Sunday with great affection. Let me begin with a prayer that I hope will in some ways capture the spirit of then and today. O God, whose blessed Son made himself known to his disciples in the breaking of the bread, open the eyes of our faith that we may behold him in all his redeeming work. Help us, we beseech you, since we are as if in peril on the great sea, so that this year's plague does not drag us off. O God, defend us everywhere with your impregnable power and protection. Deliver all your mortal limbs, all our mortal limbs, guarding each with your protective shield. We shall put on the Lord's protection today. We shall arm ourselves splendidly. He who created us shall give us strength. In the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. That was a kind of a revised combination of the excerpt from today's collect and the breastplate of Ladson. So just to give you some context for today's conversation, the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 was not the first instance in which Absalom Jones had presence in the city of Philadelphia nor exercised ministry. In 1784, he was still enslaved to Benjamin Wynkoop, who was a vestryman and a warden at the United Congregations of Christ Church in St. Peter's. And after repeatedly beseeching Wynkoop to allow him to buy his freedom, on a day in October of 1784, Wynkoop, as Absalom put it, generously granted me a manumission, and I have ever since continued to work for him at good wages. But Absalom Jones stopped attending St. Peter's and began to attend St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church, where he met another free man, Richard Allen, and the two of them became fast friends and were lay preachers and class leaders. 2 years later, they formed the Free African Society, April of 1787. They said, we, two men of the African race who from a love of their people and their complexion commune together in order to form a religious society. But there being too few of like concern and differing in religious sentiments, it was proposed that a society should be formed without regard to religious sentiments, provided that the persons lived an orderly and sober life, supporting one another in sickness and benefiting widows and orphans. W.B. Du Bois said that this was the first wavering. They took the seats that they thought they were to take. And a trustee came and, quote, had hold of Absalom Jones, Richard Allen said, pulling him up off his knees, saying, you must get up and you must not kneel here. Jones replied, wait until prayer is over. The trustee said, no, you must get up now, or I will call for aid and force you away. With that, prayer was over, and Jones and Allen led many of the worshipers, not all, out, black worshipers, out of the church at that time. The harsh laws that had regulated Philadelphia's black community's behavior had been repealed, but a new form of racial discrimination was taking its place. And it truly showed agency for a black man to speak power and to oppose a white man who had authority. In many ways, subsequent protest movements, from the civil rights movement to the Black Lives Matter movement, owe a debt to Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who pioneered nonviolent social protest. They had begun to discuss forming the African Church. The Free African Society had already started to have religious services, often officiated by the Reverend Joseph Pillmore, who was the associate priest at St. Paul's Episcopal Church on 3rd Street between Pine and Walnut, now our Episcopal Community Services headquarters. Interestingly, Pillmore had been appointed by the Reverends John and Charles Wesley as the first minister at St. George's, but he left, was ordained as an Anglican priest, and returned to the United States. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a great physician here in the city of Philadelphia, a member of the College of Physicians, helped Jones and Allen to organize the plan for their church. He even says that he debated Bishop William White, who opposed the formation of the African Church on the grounds that White said it was, quote unquote, originating in pride. In 1793, August, an interracial banquet was organized where the supporters of this African church movement served one another. First, the white banquet members sat and ate and were served by the black members, and then the black members sat and were served by the white members. But at that very moment, Rush was already aware that a quote unquote fever had broken out near Water Street, which was then between what we today know as Front Street and the Delaware River. The initial detection had about 12 or so people already dying. The government was in somewhat, the federal government, the state government, and the city government were all resident in the city of Philadelphia. And obviously, this was a great concern to them in terms of the execution of their duties and responsibilities. At the very outset, there was disagreement over what was the cause of this fever. There had been numerous fevers. There had been other yellow fever epidemics in Philadelphia. Some attributed it to the putrid smells from the rotting coffee on the docks. Some said it was the general uncleanliness in these poor neighborhoods which were close to the docks. Those were also, interestingly, more racially diverse neighborhoods. Some said it was the ships that were bringing refugees from Saint-Domingue fleeing Toussaint Louverture's Haitian Revolution. Some said it was one particular ship, the Hankey, which had also come from the Caribbean, bringing some people who were fleeing Haiti. And so at the very outset, we start to see correlations with COVID-19. Where did it originate? Was it in a lab? Was it from a transfer from animals to humans via food sources? Even though the World Health Organization recently sent a team to investigate, there is still a question. Billy G. Smith, in his book, Ship of Death, A Voyage That Changed the World, has pretty much demonstrated that the Hankey was certainly one of the ships that brought infected mosquitoes to Philadelphia. The Hankey had left England actually filled with abolitionists trying to find a place in Africa where freed enslaved people from England and the United States could go and have a homeland. And on their first stop, they picked up water with infected mosquitoes. And every stop they made thereafter, a yellow fever outbreak took place, stopping finally in Philadelphia in July of 1793. Physicians disagreed over how the disease was transmitted. The College of Physicians, to which Rush belonged, was in an uproar. Rush had relied on a pamphlet given to him by Benjamin Franklin, authored by a Virginia physician educated in England, a Dr. John Mitchell, which implemented quote unquote heroic measures, purging of the stomach and the intestines, copious bloodletting, and then fluids and rest. He vehemently disagreed with anyone who challenged his diagnosis or his treatment methods. Other physicians, those who in the city who had seen yellow fever in the West Indies had a different approach. But many of them had already 1 or 2 strikes against them. They were either French, who were not held in high regard in the city, or they were French and Jewish, and there was anti-Semitism. And so their more mild treatments, getting people away from the source of the infection, building up their bodies, giving them fluids, fresh vegetables, good foods, fluids, and plenty of rest, were discounted. But all of these physicians were working their own spheres of influence to do what they could to address what was clearly becoming an epidemic. Stephen Girard, whose wealth had come from supplying foodstuffs to the slave islands in the Caribbean, recognized that they should organize a hospital. The lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, happened to be out of town, and so they took his Bush Hill estate, which is in Northern Liberties now, and they commandeered his outbuildings, his house, and they set up a hospital which was going to apply this French cure. He employed Doctors Jean Devezay, Isaac Danassi Cohen, and others, and eventually other Philadelphians came to help and support him. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen even convinced Mayor Matthew Clarkson to free incarcerated people from the city's Walnut Street jail. If they would commit to working as nurses at the hospital, they could then have early release. Laypersons referred to this as a noxious miasmata. A multiplicity of actions were taken. You should avoid the fatigue of the body, of the mind. You shouldn't stand or sit in the sun for too long. You shouldn't even be in the open air for very long. You should accommodate your dress to the weather. Err on the side of being warm rather than being too cold. Use fermented liquors, but intemperance. Drink wines and beers and ciders. Burn fires in the streets, but then that was perceived as being dangerous given that many of the buildings were built of wood. And so they turned to burning gunpowder to purify the air, using vinegar and camphor in infected rooms and applying them to handkerchiefs to use to inhale. People carried tar in their pockets or in their hands or hung camphor bags around their necks. So many people were firing off guns that the mayor had to enact a proclamation outlawing that as a practice to rid themselves of this miasmata. So obviously today we have seen correlations with disagreements within the medical community over treatments, disputes over the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, remdesivir, dexamethasone. Was it airborne or not? How long does it take for these viruses to live on surfaces? How long does the virus stay in the air? What about mask wearing, hand washing, social distancing? Are they effective? What actually are the symptoms? Hospitals having to expand because ICUs were overrun. The use of hotel rooms, standing up field hospitals, even using hospital ships. The role of business had a role to play. Businesses were shutting down because shopkeepers were afraid and they had no clientele. The city of Philadelphia borrowed monies from the Bank of North America because they could not raise tax revenue. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen had actually borrowed monies from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in order to organize a nail factory. The nail factory never got off the ground, but the loan had to be repaid. We have seen how business activity today has been sharply impacted and curtailed. Those who cannot work from home have to go into the workplace, and a number of businesses that cannot transmit to this new work environment clearly have gone out of business. The role of government, as I mentioned, the federal, state, local government, all left the city of Philadelphia. Mayor Matthew Clarkson organized a citizens committee. So you had citizen volunteers trying to adhere to the critical operations of the city government. Neighboring counties took action to prevent Philadelphians from leaving the city. Neighboring states, as far away even as Georgia and Massachusetts were on the watch for people coming from Philadelphia because they did not want this miasma imported into their cities and towns. We know that the Trump administration's handling of COVID-19, from initial detection, personal protective equipment supplies, securing critical equipment, application of the Defense Production Act, the use of an Obama administration pandemic playbook, relationships with infectious disease experts, the role of the Centers of Disease Control, the role of the World Health Organization, interaction with state governments, questions about restrictions and mandates, vaccine acquisition, dissemination planning have all been controversial. But the Trump administration and the Biden administration passed fiscal and monetary responses to the pandemic that sought financial stimulus for businesses and financial relief for individuals. Services such as sanitation and public transportation were deemed essential. So those employees who were essential had to work at risk. We have examples like the Black physician, Dr. Alice Sanford, and the Black Doctors COVID-19 Consortium, who have organized COVID-19 testing and vaccination opportunities for underserved communities. And quarantine mandates have been implemented by states on travelers. There was an impact on social relationships. Husbands would leave wives, wives' husbands. Children fled parents, parents died, leaving no one to care for their children. We have seen how with the present COVID-19 pandemic, people of Asian descent have been particularly villainized and targeted as being the cause of this pandemic. Altercations have erupted over the enforcement of mask and social distancing mandates. Dr. Rush, again, relying on information supplied to him by Benjamin Franklin, remembered a pamphlet by Dr. John Lining, who was a prominent South Carolinian physician, trained at Edinburgh, Scotland, as had Dr. Rush. So that probably gave Dr. Lining's theory some degree of currency with Rush. He remembered he had a pamphlet on yellow fever, and when he read it, he saw that Lining made the argument that Black people were immune from the yellow fever epidemic. Given that Charleston was a major slave trading port, our own Henry Lawrence, prominent slave trader and negotiator at the end of the Revolutionary War, we believe that what Dr. Lining saw were what people called saltwater Africans, people newly brought to the shores of the United States through the Middle Passage in slave ships. And many of them likely had acquired an immunity to yellow fever as a result of having survived some previous infection in Africa, where yellow fever is endemic. Yellow fever immunity cannot be inherited or transmitted genetically. And it was not long before Rush saw that Lining was wrong and that Black Philadelphians were dying in proportional numbers to white Philadelphians. His great lament was for the impact on the ability to provide Black nurses. If they were to stop offering their services, who would fill that void? What would happen? Rush was aware that Richard Allen became ill with yellow fever, and it's unclear if Rush knew that Allen sought treatment at Bush Hill. He himself did not utilize Rush's purgative cure. We're not sure if Richard Allen and Absalom Jones actually believed this claim of immunity, given that we had seen yellow fever in Philadelphia before, as early as 1762, the year after Benjamin Wynkoop brought Absalom Jones to Philadelphia. There was an outbreak, probably the largest before 1793. So they would have seen it. They would have known that people of African descent were impacted and had died. But we have also seen today that people of color are experiencing higher levels of infection and worse outcomes. The reasons relate to underlying comorbidities: high blood pressure, diabetes, people being overweight, obscenity, sickle cell disease, liver disease, current or former smokers, stroke victims, asthma, heart disease. Many, if not all, of these conditions correlate to living in a culture still impacted by past and current forms of racism. Sadly, some suggest that these negative health impacts are the result of purely voluntary behavior. And so there is this issue of how to access health. There is also the connection between this history of racialized medical science and the Tuskegee experiment, the story of Henrietta Lacks, and its relationship to things like vaccine hesitancy in communities of color. Historians like Philip Curtin have demonstrated that the racial immunities to disease theories became one of the strongest rational supports for pseudoscientific racism in the early 19th century. Rush worked with Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, training them on his cure. And they did supply nurses who went out and had multiplicities of experiences. Today, we see that people of color are employed in high numbers in the nursing professions: nurse practitioners, registered nurses, licensed practical nurses, and licensed vocational nurses. These are jobs that are considered essential and involve interaction with the public, with infected individuals. Higher proportions of people of color live in multi-generational homes, crowded conditions, densely populated areas, which make social distancing difficult, and or depend on public transportation to get to work, which also increases their exposure to COVID-19. So many people were dying, 4,000 by the end of the pandemic, that there was a need to have burial practices. And so Cyrus Bustle, member of the Free African Society, a baker who took bread to George Washington when he and the Continental Army were camped at Valley Forge, took charge of the burial of the dead. They were even, in some instances, burying beds because of this fear of the contagion of a disease that was not contagious. The mayor ordered that the ringing of church bells for funerals cease because of the impact it was having on people. Matthew Carey wrote that it terrified those in health and drove the sick as far as the influence of the imagination could produce to their graves. We know that today with COVID-19, hospital morgues and funeral establishments have been overextended. There's been the use of refrigerated trucks to store the remains of deceased patients. The bells at the National Cathedral are only rung in observance of COVID-19 death milestones, but an interesting correlation to not ringing the bells in 1793. Unbeknownst to all, the onset of the cold weather in November started killing the mosquitoes. All they knew was the cold weather had come and new cases had stopped and deaths had dropped precipitously. Throughout the pandemic, adherence to mask and social distancing protocols drove down cases of infection and hospitalization. Lower cases of infection and hospitalization correlate to lower deaths. Spikes in infection and hospitalization track to increased numbers of group gatherings, and when mask and social distance protocols have been rescinded. The arrival of the vaccines obviously have also driven down infections and hospitalizations and deaths, but we are still dealing with a sizable anti-vax movement. In correlation, as we know, at present over 560,000 Americans have perished. Matthew Carey, who had once at one time been a mayor of Mayor Matthew Clarkson's Citizens Committee, fled the city because he had a wife and a young child, which was totally understandable. But upon his return, he wrote a short account of the malignant fever. He praised Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, but viciously excoriated Black nurses, whom he said extorted exorbitant fees for their services and stole from their employers. And Carey issued multiple reprints even after Absalom Jones and Richard Allen issued their own narrative refutation, the first copyrighted document by African-American authors in the United States, wherein they took issue with many of his charges and claims and made their own case for the heroicism of these nurses and laid out arguments where they spoke to how aggrieved they felt. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen were making arguments in their narrative to support these nurses, many of whom they knew relied upon employment of white Philadelphians in order to make a living. And so to have Matthew Carey's charges there maligning, their integrity, their behavior, their conduct would obviously harm them in terms of their future economic opportunities. Curiously, though, Jones and Allen also challenged Benjamin Rush's argument that they were immune, but they had to be very careful, obviously, as to how they worded their critique. They basically said, you know, we hope our friends will not hold this against us, but we find it is difficult for us to understand how we could have been told that this was not a disease, this was a disease that would not negatively impact us, when clearly the evidence is to the opposite. They did not want, obviously, to rupture their relationship with Benjamin Rush, who had been one of their most stalwart friends. Yet at the same time, we can see where their desire to speak honestly and truthfully for posterity required that they acknowledge their feelings about this claim of racial immunity that was so unfounded. One thing they did, which probably would consider to be extremely political, but obviously important, before they published their refutation, they sought Mayor Matthew Clarkson's written agreement and approval of their actions throughout the epidemic. And he did indeed pen to their publication a paragraph wherein he said he cheerfully gave testimony as to their diligence and decency. Billy G. Smith, in his book Ship of Death, notes that the voyage of the Hankey linked many of the communities and international forces that rotated around slavery. Yellow fever would not have gotten such a large foothold in the Atlantic world but for African slavery. History would have taken a different course, he argues. In many ways, this is a story that resonates in our own era. And he's writing in 2013 when he published the book. In our own era of intensified globalization and capitalism, the growth of both wealth and inequality, the transference of industries from affluent to poorer countries, the increasing threat of disease on a worldwide scale, and the degradation of the environment, issues which cross national borders so easily today. People living in rural communities, villages, towns, and cities are all affected by what happens in other parts of the earth. In other words, the voyage of the Hankey is a human story with relevance for our own times. And I would argue that the story of the Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic of 1793 is a human story with particular relevance to our experience with COVID-19 today. Thank you.
Arthur, thank you so much for sharing with us a story that is probably not that well known. And so, you know, again, the parallels with what we're dealing with right now are pretty amazing. And but I have two questions to maybe kick off the Q&A section. And then in about 10 minutes, I have to get ready for church at 11, so I'll be going. But my first question is, how did the response in Philadelphia compare? You were talking about that ship going from port to port, say to communities like New York, and was there support in other parts of the church for what Allen and Jones were doing? That's my first question. And then the second is there a place where were people buried? Where is there a memorialization right now in the city of people who were lost at that time?
All the churches that had burial grounds would have had people buried in them at that time. So Christ Church and St. Peter's, Gloria Dei, all of those congregations that were in existence would have had people buried there. We obviously want to be mindful of the fact that there were congregations which had burial grounds which had those bodies exhumed and moved. For instance, St. Thomas, although it did not yet have a burial ground in 1793, even though the work had begun on the construction of the church, later in 1887, when the church moves, the grave yard is exhumed and all the bodies are relocated to what was then a black cemetery called Lebanon Cemetery on Passyunk Avenue. And then they, again, when the city condemned that, they were moved again. So we know that people who were buried, their bodies were exhumed and moved elsewhere. There was also a burial site at Washington Square, and soldiers from the Revolutionary War had been buried there from, Native Americans were buried there. So we know that that is a very diverse burial ground. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, when they were first approached by Mayor Clarkson and Dr. Rush, went out and did what the Quakers would do when they were trying to assess a circumstance. They had a visiting committee, and they went out and they went to different neighborhoods, and they said they went into one house and a little girl met them at the door, and they came in and they surveyed the mantle itself and to focus energies on those who wanted to form this African Church of Philadelphia. But they said, you know, we still have these monies, we still have this structure. We need to find what it is that we can do. They said they went into prayer, and through that experience, they found the strength to go out and do the work that they felt they needed to do. My sense is kind of like the story that Martin Luther King tells around his kitchen table, that they, at that moment, probably didn't feel fear, but I would have to believe that as they actually went through the process of bleeding patients and burying the dead and finding, just living their daily lives in the cities for those 3 months, that probably was a very arduous experience, and that fear came back upon them time and time again.
Thank you. So let's open it up for other questions.
Arthur, what was the official response back then by the, and I don't know if this happened before the Episcopal Church existed as we were ending our relationship with England or not, but what was the official response to the diocese or whatever group of Episcopal churches or Anglican churches there was to the epidemic, and also to the racial issues associated with it?
Well, again, I'm not sure that the diocese as such was in a position to do very much. First of all, there were very few, congregations in the city, and all of them were beset. St. Paul's, the United Congregations of Christ Church in St. Peter's. I don't think St. James had yet been formed. And then the congregations that were farther out, St. David's, St. Peter's in the Great Valley, they unfortunately were, I think, in those communities that were saying, put up a roadblock. Don't let people from Philadelphia come into our communities, because we have heard what's happening and we are so afraid that we just don't want any of those people coming to us. Now, in some places, I'm saying, like in Delaware, they would set up a quarantine station similar to what people are being asked to do today on a voluntary basis, and they would be watched. And if anybody exhibited symptoms of fever, obviously they would not be permitted to move forward. And I guess after a period of time, if they didn't exhibit those symptoms, they would be allowed to continue on. In terms of the question about the racial attitudes, we know from the work that has been done at Christ Church and at St. Peter's, Third and Pine, Trinity, Oxford, that we had a lot of enslavers who held prominent positions in the diocese. And I would have to believe that it was their attitude that people of color were less than. They were chattel. They were here to serve their needs and demands. So the legislature in 1761, when Absalom Jones was brought to Philadelphia, was dominated by Presbyterians. And they were able to marshal a majority to implement a requirement that if you were bringing an enslaved person into Pennsylvania, you had to post a bond. Part of the concern was, these enslaved people could be left for the city to care for, but it was also an abolitionist attempt to make it more difficult for enslavers to bring their enslaved people, make it more costly, make it more expensive. Some might say maybe that was part of the reason why Benjamin Wynkoop decided to only bring Absalom, not to bring his mother, not to bring his sister, not to bring his 5 brothers. That would obviously have increased the cost of the bond that he would have had to have paid to the city, to the state. So you can have unintended consequences for the best of all possible policies and practices and procedures. My sense is, given what Absalom Jones says in his short autobiographical sketch that was reprinted in William Douglas's Annals, between the laws that had been implemented in 1700, it was an act regulating the behavior of Negroes, which prohibited things like numbers, beyond a certain number of people of African descent congregating in a particular place. The constabulary could come along and say, did not apply to indentured servants, but they applied to enslaved people who were all people of color. And so that legacy of difference, which we see even in the medical diagnoses, the claims for immunity, have a way of continuing and leaving a legacy. One of the things we know about Benjamin Rush and the Pen and Slavery Project, most of the universities that were around in the period when there was enslavement have formed an organization. Matter of fact, they just had a 2-day conference held at Georgetown, which is researching the role of the Jesuits in selling about 100 and some enslaved people in order to make the university financially stable. So the conference was held at Georgetown, and most of these universities, Harvard, Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, belong to this organization. And at Penn, they have a Pen and Slavery Project. And one of the things they have been doing is looking specifically at the legacy of Benjamin Rush, both his role as abolitionist, president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, but also his role as an enslaver who held the man, William Grubber, for 10 years as an enslaved person, and also his theory about Black skin being different, actually being a disease, a form of leprosy. And he wasn't the only physician who held that position. John, the one of the 2 physicians I mentioned before, from whom Rush learned about yellow fever, had also been studying Black skin in an attempt to understand why it was different. Rush also, in his classes at Penn Medical School, was teaching about this difference. He was opposed to interracial marriage because he felt that this diseased skin would simply become problematic for the white person and in the lineage. The white person would marry the Black person and their children. And so the students at Penn have taken a very strong position on the fact that Rush's racial theories, as evidenced through his activities in the medical school, led to the pseudoscientific racism that still informs. So in terms of this legacy of this pseudoscientific racism in the medical profession, my son, who is about to graduate from medical school, even when he started 4 years ago, there was discussions around ailments that were quote unquote based on the race of the patient. And he and others would have to push back. It's not the race of the patient, it is the medical condition of the patient oftentimes linked to their experience based on racism that has impacted them. It's not that they have this ailment or this reaction to a situation because they are African American, Latinx, Asian. It's their total social circumstance that has to be taken into consideration. And so unfortunately, here we are in 2021, and we're still in medical schools wrestling with this very same pseudoscientific medical theories that espouse the idea that based on a very unscientific observation of one group of people, that it gets extrapolated out to an entire race, even though we know race is a social construct, not a biological reality, an entire race of people as legitimate science, legitimate medicine.
So could I raise a question here, Arthur? I'd love to get your view on this. And my face here is frozen. I hope you can hear my voice.
I love the hand.
My lips are actually moving here, although it doesn't look it. So I wonder if the pandemic is awful, the current pandemic. There's no question about that. The loss of life is tragic beyond words. But I wonder if a potential positive consequence of this isn't going to be challenging the way we have dealt with the intersection between health and race. I see at least the potential, and I'd love to get your views on this, the potential for a very different conversation, which you can see beginning already, about population health and how we ensure population health you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I totally agree. And I think it's a confluence. I think it's the struggles around reimagining policing, the struggles around how we participate in our civic endeavors, i.e. voting rights, the unequal impact, the disparate impact of the pandemic and how it has renewed a focus on disparate health outcomes. I think all of those movements are working together because ultimately they have a lot in common in terms of what is the genesis of that which they are seeking to dismantle and the goal that they are trying to achieve. And while it's unfortunate that there are these struggles on these multiple platforms, I see the diocese in other church traditions, but you see this energy and this activism and this ability to connect that I was not aware of before. And so I think, again, those common struggles will impact one another, and there is no going back to the way things were before the pandemic. And so we will all be living with a new normal and looking at how we function, how we relate to one another very differently.
Yeah, that is, I couldn't agree more with that. And I also, there's an opportunity here to reshape a lot of the ways we've historically interacted. And I guess the challenge here, this takes us a little bit away from the focus of the earlier focus of the session, but the challenge is molding that in a way that's going to be sustainable. And it is, so things will never go back to the way they were before, but there's some positive moves here that I hope we're going to be able to more or less institutionalize, and it'll push us into a very different place. Arthur, I also noticed that Albert had to leave because he is on duty starting in about 5 minutes. So I'm not sure. Clark, do you have other questions? Fred, other questions? I'm just blown away. I just got to say on a personal note that I just want to thank you so much for being with us this morning. The depth of your historical and sociological insights here is really remarkable. And it's I guess the one question I would just have, and then I'll be quiet, but is are there could you suggest a couple of references if one wanted to do a somewhat a deeper dive, now that you've laid out so many interesting parts of the story? Are there one or two references that you pass on for someone who wanted to go a little deeper?
Oh, certainly. As a matter of fact, I was going to send Father Dan a sort of reading list
Oh,
that
great,
you can
great.
pick from. But just quickly, I'll mention two books. One is a book by the book I was speaking about by Billy G. Smith, Ship of Death, wherein he charts the course of the Hankey. Billy Smith is a professor at Montana State University. He studied under Gary Nash, who authored Forging Freedom, which really is the best book to talk about the life of Absalom Jones in the context of Philadelphia. And he was one of Gary's students, so he a lot of his research, I'm sure Gary imported into his book. But his book, and then there is a professor at the University of Illinois at Champaign, Rana Hogarth, who has a book, Medicalizing Blackness, Making Racial Difference in the Atlantic World. And her first chapter is on the yellow fever epidemic. And she really has a great fluidity with the science and the medicine, and cites a number of sources that I'm going to look into. She does make one error. She talks about forming a denomination
Now you're back.
in 1816. So, this idea that, Rush went to Allen because he was this luminary in Philadelphia in 1792, I don't think is well-founded at all. His prestige doesn't really start to take off until the early 1800s and on into 1816, when they actually formulate the African Methodist Episcopal Church denomination. So I will send that to Father Dan. And the only other thing I would suggest is that in our diocese, as I'm sure everyone knows, Bishop Gutierrez has been working with a group of clergy on the Loving Presence Committee, and they have produced the Loving Presence document. And I was working with the task force of the Anti-Racism Commission. And so I know that there are plans to figure out how every congregation can either engage with this work, or if they are already engaging with this work, how they can move it to a new level of engagement so that it really does start to evidence the kind of change we all know that the gospel requires of us as Christians, seeing the light of Christ in one another and treating one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. And so a lot of people still may not understand just how radical a commitment that is, and to the need to really engage with what does justice require of us. If I say I know God, to go to the Latin American liberation theologians, to say that you know God means that you will do justice. And so what does that mean on the ground, in my life, in my sphere of influence? How do I act that out in a way that is true to the gospel and in a way that I'm comfortable with, even as I am continuing to grow in my own awareness of who I am and of the circumstances around me and how they impact all of my brothers and sisters around me.
That's a great way for us to end. And Arthur, it's always good to see you, whether it's at St. Paul's or at a history committee meeting. And we've got to go to church in about 2 minutes. So God bless and thanks very much. And we will look forward to you. I'm sure that a lot of people will be watching this later on. And it was a great honor to have you here. And we all learned a great deal. So have a wonderful Sunday and thanks again.
Thank you, and do likewise. Take care.
Amen.